Appreciated the first message today. I think you'll find as we go along here over the next 50 minutes or so that they'll fit in very nicely. Seems that God was able to get through two knuckleheaded individuals to bind a message together. So really appreciate always seeing God's hand in things as we go forward. A little different message today than you're probably used to hearing from me, but I think certainly a subject that should be apropos for today, but also something for everyone who has an ear to hear. 20 years ago or so, Tina and I sat in our living room in the evening with our pastor. We called him up and had him come by to anoint our daughter who was ill, and we felt it was rather urgent, so it's not one of those phone calls you like to make late at night to the pastor, but they happen. And, we knew it was late. We felt kind of bad calling him at that kind of late hour, even though when he arrived, of course, he assured us that he was happy to come. After the anointing, he seemed content to sit for a while and allow us to kind of de-stress. I think part of a job of a parent or a social worker or even in the ministry is to give people an opportunity to just talk and kind of vent and kind of come to a balance about any kind of stressful situation that they're in. In general, I think a lot of people know where they need to be when they get in stress. They kind of can repeat to you where they need to be. They just may need time to get there. And so he was affording us that opportunity to just talk and sat and listened and chatted about whatever came to our minds. And it's been so long ago that I don't really remember how we got on the subject of child rearing, whether it was purposeful on his part or not, whether he led the conversation there or not, I don't remember. But the inevitable question was asked of him concerning his wisdom on rearing children. And he took a breath, and then he said something similar to this. Again, I don't have a memory that can recall every single word, but the concept. He said, child rearing is not a perfect science. Sometimes what works for one family doesn't work for another. Sometimes what works for one child in a family doesn't work for another child in the same family. The reality is you're always a more equipped parent after you raise your children and they've moved on. The best counsel I can give, he continued, is begin with the end in mind. Begin with the end in mind. He went on to say he didn't coin the phrase. He had picked it up years ago from a Stephen Covey book entitled 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This book here, many of you have probably read it over the years. I recognized the book because my dad had read it and he had passed it on to me. But hearing him talk about it connected it to what we were going through at the time as a young family. This idea resonated with us. As parents, it's natural for us to think about kids' futures. All of us want our kids to grow up and be successful, well-balanced adults. And in the body of Christ, we want more than that, right? We want our kids to have a personal relationship with God. We understand our children are really God's children. And while we have them maybe for 18 to 20 years under our roof and under our control somewhat, they're God's children. And they're God's children for eternity. Begin with the end in mind is an easy concept for us to understand when we enter a traditional day like today, the blessing of children. It's an easy concept for us to grasp. As detailed by Stephen Covey in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, this habit is the second one in his book. And this book was released in 1989, and it really immediately became a credible resource for growth and development. Corporations gleaned from its principles and put them to practice. It became a really rich, individual, valuable tool for people in their corporate lives, but also in families, and affected families in a very profound way. Today, we're appropriately focused on little children, new babies added to families over the year. Have churches like ours all over the world celebrating these new children, seeking to bless them, pass along God's blessing. Not just God's blessing, but congregations seeking to bless children by activities and by loving them and by helping their parents and by creating a church environment where they can grow safely. The church, as I said, is set aside the second Sabbath following the feast as a blessing of children, and this has been a long tradition in the church, and one that we've always very much enjoyed. Today, we'll explore this habit that Stephen Covey coined, begin with the end in mind. We'll examine it because this principle fits quite nicely on the day when we turn our minds towards our youngest. It's an opportunity to talk about child rearing and the need for parental, family, and church influence in their lives. The principle also fits nicely into our calling. So in case anyone wanted to nod off for the next few minutes because maybe this doesn't apply to them, there is nuggets in here for you. Now let me begin by reading from the book concerning habit number 2, begin with the end in mind. Mr. Covey says, in your mind's eye, see yourself going to the funeral of a loved one. Picture yourself driving to the funeral, parking the car, getting out. And as you walk inside the building, you notice the flowers, the soft music being played. You see the faces of friends and family you pass along the way. You feel the shared sorrow of losing, the joy of having known, that radiates from the hearts of the people there. As you walk down to the front of the room and look inside the casket, you suddenly come face to face with yourself. This is your funeral. All of these people have come to honor you, to express feelings of love and appreciation for your life. As you take a seat and wait for the services to begin, you look at the program in your hand, and there are 4 speakers. The first is from your family, immediate and also extended, children, brothers, sisters, nephews, nieces, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, who have all come from all over the country to attend. The second speaker is one of your friends, someone who can give a sense of what you were as a person. The third speaker is from your work or profession. And the fourth is from your church, where you've been involved in service. Now think deeply. What would you like each of these speakers to say about you and your life? What kind of husband, wife, father, or mother would you like their words to reflect? What kind of son or daughter or cousin? What kind of friend? What kind of working associate? What character would you like them to have seen in you? What contributions, what achievements would you want them to remember? Look carefully at the people around you. What difference would you like to have made in their lives? So now you conceptually understand where the author is going when he says, begin with the end in mind. Now, children just don't become something. They're made something. They are made what they are made by everything from deliberate visionary planning, and that's one side of the spectrum where we're very deliberate about what they eat, what they consume, mentally, physically, spiritually. And then the other end of the spectrum, what comes natural to them, things that just come natural to them, that they do naturally. Each one of us can look back into our own personal developmental timeline, and we can trace our habits and character makeup to maybe someone that began in the very early stages of our life being deliberate about how they taught us, either through personal example, discipline, education, or all of these together. You know, what a blessing when an infant is born into a family where it has all the elements it will need to choose to be successful. I suspect many of you listening today can probably point to some holes that existed in your upbringing that manifested itself in your life in ways that have not been pleasant through the years. Maybe those things cost you some relationships along the way. Maybe they cost you possessions. They cost you money. They cost you loss in some way. Maybe deep personal harm. And here we are dealing with these things many, many years later under God's scriptural tutelage, learning to repair the damage, learning to get down to the core of what those problems and issues are, and then changing those things, changing our base to meet what God demands of us and teaches us. From flawed carnal and physical views to godly, spiritual, foundational views. You know, as an observation I will share that probably won't surprise any of you, one of the greatest failings in dysfunctional families is child rearing by reaction. A deeply dysfunctional family operates without the protection and blessing of planning. If you sit back and you watch families like this, you'll see eventual chaos and pain that kind of takes over a family when there's lack of planning. To a certain extent, dysfunction exists in every household. All of us have a certain amount of dysfunction in some form or fashion. You know, if we didn't, we'd be perfect, and I know none of us are. The reality is we have things that we're given by our parents that we must work to overcome and change, on top of the things that we add along the way in our own life, that poor decisions that we make of our own. You know, our greatest contribution to our children is knowing where you want to go, and then both rear and steer them to that end. God our Father in Exodus and in Deuteronomy teach in simple, plain terms the 10 Commandments, the 10 things to do and don't do. He offers a happier life and some promises to make our lives much more full and rich and full of joy. And if we fulfill these 10 Commandments before Him and we begin to adopt His way of life, these blessings come to us. Turn to Deuteronomy 5, if you would. Deuteronomy chapter 5, and we'll pick it up in verse 9. Embedded in the second commandment is both wise counsel and a promise from God. And it's an important one. Now I'm going to read these two scriptures, verse 9 and 10 of Deuteronomy 5 out of the New Living Translation because I like the language. Verse 9, it says, "You must not bow down to them." So we're breaking into the Ten Commandments here, in the second commandment. "You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me." And in verse 10, "But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands." The reality is, brethren, God doesn't sit at his throne and point his finger and curse and then point his finger and bless. He doesn't have to. This happens naturally to us. God lets it happen. He's telling us up front that this is something I've set in motion, and it will happen. Each generation will pass on to their children the cursings that come from not obeying God. And it's easy for us now to look around at our society today, and we can see the evidence that's being produced to prove what God said will happen. Eventually, we'll get to the place of Noah's time, as we heard earlier, where people intended to practice only evil continually. But Noah was also a representative of the blessing side of what our Father mentions in Deuteronomy. In Genesis 6:8 and 9, you don't need to turn there, I'm just going to pick those two. Noah had found favor in verse 8 with the Lord. The statement that Noah had found favor. And in verse 9 it says, "This is a genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect or righteous in his generations. Noah walked with God." So why did Noah find favor? Well, he walked with God. He was in lockstep with God. Why did he walk with God? He came from a genealogy who walked with God. It's interesting to note that Noah's father Lamech was with him and died very shortly before the flood. Lamech would have been alive for the last 56 years of Adam's life. It's interesting. There was some continuity there, all down through that lineage. Noah would have known Enoch, his grandfather, who Scripture says walked with God as well. Noah would have been alive for the first 60 years of Abraham's life. There was overlap. There was a genealogy of people Noah was connected to and had a history of walking with God. Now, I'm saying all this because Noah just didn't one day wake up righteous. That just doesn't happen. Abraham just didn't wake up being faithful. They learned. We read a short little sections of Scripture, and in many cases we're not privy to the backstory of what was in motion long before we get to peer through Scripture at an individual where God makes a statement. Long before these men reached the place of being righteous, God calls him righteous, or Abraham being faithful, there was something going on behind the scenes. Someone had to begin with the end in mind. Now, all of you have backstories. What do I mean by backstory? Tina and I were talking with other couples in the church about 10 plus years ago in a social setting, and we were chatting about our children in a general sense, the kind of conversation you get together with families that have similar age kids that you do, and so there's these after dinner conversations about raising kids and all the small talk normal people do during those times of those gatherings. And we were on the topic of the challenges of parenting and how some kids are just tougher to raise than others, and how difficult it had been for one set of parents with their seemingly high energy children. And I remember this parent turning to Tina and I in the middle of this conversation and making a statement that spoke to an inability to fully understand the backstory of our family. This person said, "You're fortunate that you have all even-tempered children." How do you think that made us feel? Well, we didn't respond. But you can be sure that the conversation in the car on the way home was animated. Very much so. It was, to be sure, an ignorant statement, and one made with a very myopic and selfish view. In this simple statement, all of our years of focused and deliberate hard work was cheapened, was discredited. In this person's mind, we had been handed a stacked deck in our favor. Now, this situation taught us a valuable lesson about seeing the face of a building and not knowing what's going on behind it. The old judge the book by the cover lesson. But this situation also offered up another lesson to us. How had we been able to raise our children to a standard where others would look at them and say, they must have been easy to raise? Following the beginning with the end in mind topic, there's a part of this that comes natural to us, that God has kind of hardwired into us as human beings. Let me explain it in this way. When a couple gets pregnant for the first time, there's a joy like no other. If you can remember back to those days, it's unique. It's your first. And the minds of both the perspectives of the father and mother turn to nesting in their own ways. Every thought concerning the house, the furniture, the cabinets, the plants, what car seat to buy, the pets, everything that this child will eventually come into contact with is under an intense scrutiny by the parents. There isn't anything within the parents' control that won't be examined and found either safe or not safe, and then either kept, altered, or gotten rid of before this child enters the house. What are they doing? They're beginning with the end in mind. They're thinking ahead. Before this child arrives on the scene, there's all these things that must be done to protect that child. They instinctively know they must get this child from complete dependence, to a place where they can reason with it, and that they're confident that the kid, when they sit down and talk about, you can't touch this or it will harm you, that there's a connection, that they understand it. And that may be somewhere in the 2 to 3 year. So they've got to get from 0 to 2 or 0 to 2.5 or 0 to 3, where some of those items in the house can begin to find their way back out and visible, and it's still safe for the child. How had Tina and I been able to make what was not easy look easy to someone else? Well, we had a level of inherent ability that we did not fully understand at the time. We were being shown that, but we didn't know the answer to the question of how someone would be able to look at us and our kids and say, "Oh, you had it easy." Remember, I made the statement earlier, children don't just become something, they are made something. Something was happening inside our family that we hadn't fully considered or really understood yet. And it wasn't being blessed with children that were just easy to raise. There was a backstory. It was the Deuteronomy 5 of God paying it forward through our parents' obedience to Him. It was built within us, a foundation of godly teaching and experience, the experience of living it and watching it be lived. Parents before us had received this blessing from God for obeying Him and were benefiting from the promises of God playing out in their lives. Even if we had not recognized it before, we were beginning to see it. That it wasn't us. It was about God investing in our parents and us growing up in that environment, and the blessings that God promises in Deuteronomy 5 playing itself out in our family, even in a way we didn't realize was happening. If we can find ourselves beginning with the end in mind naturally as new parents plan for the safety of a coming child, then we can grasp this concept that Stephen Covey coined in his book. God hardwired into humanity a basic ability to begin with the end in mind. It comes natural to new parents, right? So we understand the principle and we see it in its basic form, and we have a fundamental understanding that God not only understands the principle, but He's the progenitor of it, and He is the rewarder of it. Okay, so if we can begin with the end in mind on a small project, on a small scale, like the first 2 years of an infant's life, that same principle applies to longer projects, lengthier timelines in our life. Now I'm going to present some more illustrations that might help us. Before I do, let me stop briefly and address a counterfeit that exists so that we're aware of it. There's a clever counterfeit that exists that many young parents can grab onto that can lead them in the wrong direction. Now, a counterfeit, most of you know what it means, but I'll just state it. It's something made in exact imitation of something valuable or important with the intention to deceive or defraud. There's a counterfeit. Now, almost everyone arrives at a place in life where we're happy with some of or all of the elements and how we were reared, but very few of us can look back at how we were brought up by our parents and say 100% love everything they did. There's always something that we say, I'm going to do it differently. We can have strong feelings about the faults that we perceive that our parents had and passed on to us as they reared us. It manifests itself by this. You can identify it by this statement, and you may even said it to yourself. I'm not going to do that with my kids. I would imagine if I asked for a raise of hands, everyone in here would raise their hand that they have said that. Parents who suffer from this motivation can be deeply committed parents. Don't get me wrong. Just because you've said this doesn't make you a bad parent. You can be a very dedicated and committed parent, but they are deeply committed not to go somewhere. And there are some parents, and I think that some of you might recognize this in maybe some friends or acquaintances that you've met. Some parents are so adamant about not doing what their parents did for them that they're more committed not to do something than to do something. Remember, they're not going somewhere. They're stated that they're not going somewhere more than they're committed to going somewhere. This is a clever counterfeit. Just because you're deeply committed to not doing something doesn't mean you'll avoid committing your own set of mistakes. And we know that based on our own probably parental experience. I've seen this process in my own family and the mindset of many other couples. They would say my life was impacted in a negative way by how my parents raised me, and I will not allow these set of things to exist in my family. Now, this mindset is at its core a reaction, not a true plan to go somewhere. It's the old sports adage for those of you that are used to, the sports language of playing a game not to lose rather than playing a game to win. You'll not find too many successful coaches, probably none, that spend a lot of prep time with their teams on all the things they shouldn't do. But rather they put in a game plan of things that if they do these things, they will be successful. So here's a practical example of something you might identify with. Picture a home where every time Dad gets frustrated or is under any kind of personal pressure, he yells. As a child growing up in that home, a basic hatred for yelling is fostered. And unfortunately, even some of that hatred will bleed over, and they don't just hate the yelling, they end up hating the yeller. And that carries with it its own issues. The child moves out, starts their own family, and says to themselves, I'm going to raise my children in a home where no one ever yells. Is this an end? Is raising children in a home where no one ever yells and screams an end? Or is it a means to an end? There's a reason people don't yell and scream at each other in healthy relationships. We know that. Train to the reason, not to the action. If you teach a child to love others, to love and honor the person they marry, to treat people with respect, there is little need or desire to yell or scream as a form of communication. If you just teach a child not to scream, they won't necessarily grow up and treat people with respect and love. Train to the reason, not to the means or action. Okay, back to the plan, beginning with the end in mind. If as a young parent you can see in your mind's eye the person you want to have stand in front of you as an adult, then you can kind of reverse engineer, right? You can then picture this adult, this fully functioning adult as your kid, and then you can begin to walk back through the years and reverse engineer your way to inherent principles your child must possess in order to be this image of what you say this person ought to be able to handle themselves and to be able to function properly. Now, when we're talking about child rearing, I'm gonna read another section here in Stephen Covey's book, the last little section here that I'll read. Because I think it's very useful. It says, begin with the end in mind is based on a principle that all things are created twice. There's a mental or first creation and a physical or second creation to all things. Take the construction of a home, for example. You create it in every detail before you ever hammer the first nail into place. You try to get a very clear sense of what kind of house you want. If you want a family-centered home, you plan to put a family room where it would be a natural gathering place. You plan sliding doors and a patio for the children to play outside. You work with ideas. You work with your mind until you get a clear image of what you want to build. Then you reduce it to a blueprint and develop construction plans. All of this is done before the earth is even touched. If not, then in the second creation, the physical creation, you will have to make expensive changes that may double the cost of your home. The carpenter's rule is measure twice, cut once. You have to make sure that the blueprint, the first creation, is really what you want, that you've thought everything through, that you've put it into bricks and mortar. Each day you go to the construction shed and pull out the blueprint and get marching orders for the day. You begin with the end in mind. The same is true with parenting. If you want to raise responsible, self-disciplined children, you have to keep the end clearly in mind. As you interact with your children on a daily basis, this is increasingly important. You can't behave toward them in ways that undermine their self-discipline or self-esteem. I stop there. So if we're talking about child rearing, we go through these trait by trait. If you have reversed engineered now and you've said, okay, here's this set of traits that I want my child to have. Now, there are many traits. There's a long list, probably. And that list will probably grow as you begin to parent. Because remember, I said you're the best parent that you can be after your kids leave the house. So this is a growing process, right? There are many traits, and a planning parent wants to make sure that their child ends up with the best traits at their disposal. For the sake of time, let's just grab one and examine it. Let's just take the subject of respect, for example. In the spirit of the principle of beginning with the end in mind, we say to ourselves, when my son or daughter reaches adulthood, I want them to have the trait of respectfulness. I want them to have the inherent ability to treat others with respect. Now, when I say inherent ability, it means I want it to be natural to them. I want it to be somewhat effortless for them to treat others with respect. So what are the steps to get there? Well, there can be a ton of do's and don'ts, a ton of situational scenarios that come up in your life and the child's life that we could talk about do's and don'ts until the sun goes down. We won't do that. But what are the guiding principles behind the actions that will foster respect? Respect begets respect. It's a rule. If you want to have respect, you have to give respect. If you want respect for a lifetime, you have to give respect for a lifetime. Most of you are familiar with this last name, Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was a billionaire many years ago. And in the course of his day, he commanded fortunes that his family had owned and operated many businesses and affected thousands, if not millions, of lives with his wealth. And his son, John D. Rockefeller III, was about 14 years old. And his father wrote a memorandum between Papa and John regarding an allowance. And it's out there if you want to search it. You can probably find it. There are 14 different components that were addressed in this memo. Now, we won't go through them all, but here's a billionaire speaking to his 14-year-old son. And the 14th component was written as such. The allowance above set forth in the agreement under which it shall be arrived at shall continue in force until changed by mutual consent. To get respect, you have to give respect. To establish a life of respect, you must model it and hold yourself to it, no matter your station or authority. Here was a man who wielded an extreme amount of power in the business world, and yet had a 14-year-old son in which he made a compact about an allowance, and the very last part of that agreement was that I won't alter this in any way unless the two of us do it together. Pretty powerful for that child. When I was 17, and I may have shared pieces of this story before, when I was 17, I had a friend who was in the church but had moved out of town and was in a very rough family situation, broken family. They had moved. I knew my parents didn't like me hanging out with this particular individual. They had told me more than once that they would really like me to find other friends to hang around with. It was one of those conversations. I imagine my parents were somewhat relieved when they moved out of town. They never said, but I imagine being a parent, having a child that's hanging around with somebody that was always into trouble, be kind of happy if that child ended up moving out of town, giving you a little bit of relief from worry. One Friday, this friend called me, and he was desperate on the phone. He was desperate to leave his painful family life, and he was going through a life-altering situation that he felt was critical at his new school. And frankly, he needed an intervention. And he asked me if I would pick him up at the bus station that night, if he could just buy a bus ticket and come into Portland, if I would just pick him up and take him home. Now, Dad and Mom had no idea what I had promised him I would do. In fact, when I asked to borrow the car, they didn't think twice about it. But when I came home with my friend and his suitcase, the gig was up. They knew something was up. It was Friday night. Not a word was said. Mom got a sleeping bag, put it in my room. Dad retired to the den for prayer, I assume. And silence existed all through the Sabbath. Went to church, nothing was said. Car ride there and back, nothing said. Saturday night, nothing said. Tension was beginning to build in me because I had put them in a situation that I was not comfortable with. Dad woke up Sunday morning, came into our room, and he said, "Hey, breakfast is going to be in 30 minutes. Get ready, be at the table." I had put my parents in a precarious situation, and this was not very respectful of me as a 17-year-old. And we sat around that table and had a conversation, and Dad addressed the elephant in the room. And in the course of the conversation, trying to figure out why this happened, Dad made a statement that I'll never forget. Sorry, I get emotional. He turned and looked at my friend and he said, "You're still here because I trust my son's decision." Then he continued to lay down the law of how things were going to work if he was going to be there, some ground rules, and he did stay with us for the next 6 months. Later my dad made another deposit in my overdrawn account. He asked me why I had not come to him earlier and involved him from the beginning. And I said, "I knew there was a chance you would say no. And I just couldn't have that be the answer." Now, I know looking back, this probably smarted a bit for him. It would for me as a parent. But then my dad said something that that really deposited in me. He looked at me and he said, "I respect you for that, even though I may not agree with you." If you want to have respect, you have to give it. If you want respect for a lifetime, you have to give respect for a lifetime. Now, for young parents, when a child grows up in a home where respect flows both directions between mom and dad, and the respect flows out of the home to other people, the end result is this person not only understands respect when they see it, but they have learned to model it. They've witnessed it at work, and they've witnessed the benefits of it. And it becomes natural for them to act in a similar way. The society I grew up in has changed considerably over the years, especially in this general respect towards authority. I'll give you a simple example. When my dad was a young boy, and you can probably relate to this, your parents or those that are older in the crowd. When my dad was a young boy, if he got in trouble at school, he got in trouble at home. And there was no discussion about why he got in trouble till after he got a whipping. If you got in trouble at school, you were in trouble when you got home. In today's culture, if a child gets into trouble at school, the parents or parent, they're seeking a pound of flesh. No one's going to tell their child what to do or how to do it. So they march down to the school and they threaten legal trouble. Now, I'm not advocating blind adherence to wrong motives. That's not what I'm after. But where's respect gone? As a society, we demand it. We hear demands. If you watch the news, I know some of you probably don't want to watch the news half the time, but if you watch the news, everybody is demanding respect. And yet, no one wants to give it. We've shifted from an attitude of, you treat me with respect. You treat with respect those that are over you, or when you get home, you're in trouble. If you get in trouble with them, you're in trouble with me. That was the motto of what my dad grew up in. He knew the standard was he was to respect those over him. Period, end of story. It didn't matter what happened. The giving of respect was paramount. We've changed to an attitude, if you get in trouble with them, I'm going to tell them that they don't have any right to tell you what to do. We have moved and shifted considerably. As a society, we're not churning out children. We're not churning out adults that understand respect. Now, there are some scriptures that are pretty blunt and to the point in regard to this topic of respect. Jude 8 and 8 through 10. It's a bit blunt. We won't read that one. We'll go to 2 Peter 2. It's slightly less forward, but still very blunt. 2 Peter chapter 2. We have to break into kind of a very long account here by Peter to capture something he says that addresses what we're talking about. And 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 10, we'll pick it up there. And especially those who walk according to the flesh in the lust of uncleanness and despise authority. They are presumptuous, self-willed. They are not afraid to speak evil of dignitaries. Whereas angels, who are greater in power and might, do not bring a reviling accusation against them before the Lord. But these, like natural brute beasts, made to be caught and destroyed, speak evil of the things they do not understand, and will utterly perish in their own corruption. It's pretty easy to speak evil of things we don't understand when we don't know the backstory. We don't have all the facts. What Peter offers up here is some insight into parenting, whether he knew it or not. It wasn't his focus. Parenting wasn't his focus here, but he offers up some insight into parenting. He addresses false prophets and false teachers, but the principle here remains. The angels have the good sense to know whom they serve, and they keep their mouth shut when it comes to the things that are in the Lord's authority and not their own. And they show respect. Peter said there are those that think they live of their own authority and speak evil of and toward others. And these people have an end. They have an end. It's not the end result any of us want. Some of us have witnessed this kind of disrespect in recent years in some form or fashion in the church. Hopefully it causes us, when we see it, to think about where we stand spiritually and why we're standing where we're standing. Where did the angels learn respect? Their Lord is our Lord. And Christ, while he was on the earth, left an abundant legacy of modeling respect. Where do our children learn respect. I pray some of what I have witnessed personally over the past few years inside the gates of God's church will not produce children who disrespect God and His Son. Respect is just one of the elements godly parents desire their children to have. It's just one. It's just one element. There are many more excellent qualities we want our little ones, who we celebrate today. We want them to possess these things, these enduring attributes of our God, tools that they can use for their personal success. Proverbs 12:24, in closing, reads, "The hand of the diligent will rule, but the lazy man will be put to forced labor." You know, this principle rings true in parenting as it does in our personal lives as well. If we are purposeful and disciplined about what we put into the job of parenting or into our own lives, if we're disciplined and we're purposeful about what we put into the job of parenting, about who we are as parents, and who we want our children to become, then Proverbs 20, verse 7 applies. And I'll read it out of the NIV. Proverbs 20, verse 7. "The righteous lead blameless lives. Blessed are their children after them." The enduring, godly, spiritual principles we choose to live by as parents are a generational blessing from God. The Godhead began with the end in mind, and everything they have been doing together has been to a set of blueprints that the two of them created. Choose every day to live your lives in God by beginning with the end in mind, and you will not be disappointed with the outcome.